Okay. Well, welcome. Thank you all for joining us for our session on the temperate forests of the Pacific Coast and their role in climate. Thank you all for being here, and thanks to our speakers for being here, and a great big thanks to ClimateWorks for being our host at this event. And the good news is the event was oversubscribed, so we're live streaming it here. And the doors will probably not open for anybody else. They'll go into another room. So we're going to keep what happens in this room will not stay in this room. So I think everybody here is more than familiar with the curves that the IPCC has put out about our next 100 years under climate change. And 3 of those 5 curves basically say we're toast. And life as we know it is toast. 2 of the curves are slightly more hopeful. One says, you guys, you have a shot. And that's if you work with forests and other lands, you have a shot. And the best of all curves, which I like to call the thin green line, is the curve where we really pay attention to forests. And that's the one where our future, our children and grandchildren's future, and all the biodiversity on Earth's future really has a decent shot. You know, forests are the one emission sector which has emitted billions of tons of CO2 due to human decisions that can reabsorb those. And our 3 panelists today are decision makers in the 3 most productive conifer forests on Earth: Washington, Oregon, and California. Little known but true, these forest types store 2 to 12 times more carbon per acre than any other forest type in the world. But they also create the wildlife, the water, the wonder, and actually a lot of the wealth that many people on the West Coast benefit from and globally. So we share forest types from California, Oregon to Washington, whether it's our oak savannas and the marvelous Oregon oak, or it's our ponderosa pines and Douglas fir. We share those forests. We share the atmosphere, but we have different political, social, and economic contexts. And like everything in climate change, it's less about the people and the decisions that we make. So these 3 leaders are going to walk us through their thoughts and experiences of what they're doing or planning to do with regard to forests and forest management for a more carbon-rich, climate-resilient future. And I'm going to briefly introduce them here in the order that they're speaking. They're going to speak, 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to open up questions. So a good half of this concourse will be discourse. So Meta Loftsgaarden is the Executive Director for the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, also known as OWEB, or the OWEB of life. And Meta is someone who has a passion for sustainability, whether it's environmental, community, economic. And she brings, how many years have you been? 13 years with OWEB, is that right?
No, I've only been 6 years with OWEB.
6 years with OWEB, but also run similar kinds of endeavors in Montana. She's probably eminently qualified because she's got a master's in public administration, we're the public, and also has studied a great deal in agriculture and forestry. Hilary Franz, who will come last, even though she's in the middle, is a statewide elected official in Washington. She's the 14th Commissioner for Public Lands. And she was elected in November of 2016. Public lands are a dominant feature on the landscape in Washington State. And many people think of, oh, it's the Forest Service that does most forestry in the West. But actually, in Washington State, it is Hilary who does that.
She's you're live streaming that today.
Yeah. Well, I know she can take it because she's an attorney from Northeastern Law School. But she has as her charge to protect 5.8 million acres, is that right? Of forests, farms, wetlands, to sustain local economies. So that's her mission. And she also brings to it a background in the environmental law field and has championed a number of other environmental causes as well. And last but in the middle is Ashley Conrad-Saydah, who is the Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy at Cal EPA. And amongst other things, she and Keely E. Bright were the authors of California's Forest Carbon Plan, which I highly recommend to all of you, and we will distribute a link for, to really look at the range of things that California is or is intending to do around forests to enhance a more carbon-rich, climate-resilient future. So with that, I'm going to ask Maida to start off and give us a sense of what you're up to in Oregon.
Excellent. Well, first, Laurie, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's great to be here. We appreciate our work with Pacific Forest Trust and to ClimateWorks for hosting this event. So I'm going to talk from a fairly broad perspective today about some of the background in Oregon that I think is, the interests are pretty common between the states, and maybe the approaches that we've taken are a little different. So from the outside looking in from a purely climate lens, I would say that Oregon is a bit more the newcomer in terms of climate legislation. California has legislation. We're all learning great lessons from that. Washington isn't far behind. And Oregon really began our climate conversations in earnest around legislation just this last year, and we'll be proceeding in the 19th session to move forward a lot of the things we're learning from both of the states. But I would say from a resilience and a restoration and a biodiversity perspective, we each have had our own journeys over the last 30, 40 years that have really laid a framework and provided a grounding for what we are now able to do in our temperate forests in the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to talk about a few of those things as a kickoff, and then again, as Laurie said, would love to dig more into some examples that we have in Oregon as we move further into this discussion. So from this holistic perspective, Oregon really started its work in thinking about resilient ecosystems that can have a benefit for climate change and habitat and diversity and water about 40 years ago when we started with the state's land use system. Oregon is incredibly unique in not just the land use laws that govern the state, but how strongly we've chosen to implement them. I'm not going to talk in a lot of detail, but I'm going to provide a little bit of a framework of that so it helps you understand why we think that we have some pretty phenomenal opportunities to continue to protect those forest lands in the future. And then about 20 years ago, our state approved what's called the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds that really looks at a number of components for how we maintain these lands, again, moving forward, whether they are forest lands or agricultural lands in the state. So just a bit of general background. As Laurie mentioned, the Pacific Northwest forests are among the most highest carbon density forests in the world, are the highest carbon density forests in the world. And in Oregon, our Global Warming Commission has noted that all Oregon forests are net carbon sinks. So these are things that we want to maintain. These are an incredibly precious resource. It's critical for all of us across all three states to maintain those resources. So the first thing that we believe in Oregon is we've got to keep those forests as forests. The thing we don't want to do is lose the opportunity to be able to continue to have sinks because we've converted those forests to subdivisions or something else. So in 1973, Oregon passed its land use law system in the state. There are 19 goals around the land use system. I'm not going to go through all of them with you today. But after the first two, which talk about citizen involvement and planning, the next two priorities in the state are agriculture and forestry. Our state holds a really high value on maintaining farmland as farmland, maintaining forest land as forest land. Under forestry, the goal is to conserve forest lands by maintaining the land base and making growing and harvesting of forest tree species in a sustainable manner as a leading economic use on those forest lands. That now ties perfectly into the conversations we're having about climate, about carbon sequestration, about resiliency in our systems. So the question becomes, how have we done, right? So we have this policy on the books. Since 1974, Oregon has maintained 98% of its wildland forests. The biggest shifts have happened, thank you. The biggest shifts have happened in the smaller non-industrial forests, but when we look at our large forest systems, they are largely intact and can continue to be available for sequestration, for resiliency, for biodiversity. That land use provides our basis and our framework. On top of that, then we built, again, what we call the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds. That plan focuses on voluntary restoration of the habitats that support our native fish and wildlife, of the water quality that supports our people, our fish and wildlife. And what that means is that we aren't just looking at our forests as something that we need to keep in place. We're looking at them as something that we need to expand in terms of biodiversity and habitat restoration and resiliency. We built our plan on voluntary restoration, on coordinating state, federal, and tribal efforts with a sound basis in monitoring and independent science review. So we're trying to be as foundational as we can in that system to again ensure that while our forests are there, we're continuing to make them healthy. While we focus on native species, as you know, that focus on native species helps us to keep strong biodiverse forests and agriculture systems. I'll close with, I was at a coastal climate conference just a few weeks ago, and I feel horrible because I did not write down the name of the gentleman who said this. But one of the speakers noted the things we should be paying attention to in terms of forest climate systems. The first thing is that we have to be more flexible than the system. So when we look at what we're doing with our land use laws, what we're doing with our restoration, we have to be more adaptable than the system is so that we can continue to be ahead of the game. We need to be aggressively open to new ideas. That's something that our board believes very firmly in, and we need to be really cooperative and collaborative. So our agency invests about $100 million a biennium in this work on the ground with private landowners. We hold to these tenets that we've got to be as flexible, as aggressively open to new ideas as possible, and really cooperative and collaborative. I have examples of what we have done as a part of our conversation, but I'll leave that here for now and bring the examples in as you all have questions.
Thanks. Great. Thank you. Thanks to Laurie and Pacific Forest Trust for hosting us to ClimateWorks, and thanks to all of you for coming today. And if you're sticking around for the summit, we really appreciate that. It's been 2 years of hard work to get the summit off the ground. So thank you for being here. So my name's Ashley Conrad-Saydah. I'm Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy at the California Environmental Protection Agency. And as Laurie mentioned, one of the many areas I work on is on forests. And she gave Kaylee Ebright and me credit for the Forest Carbon Plan, but I have colleagues here, including Edie Chang in the back, who worked with us for 3 years on that plan, and Paul Mason provided comments. So it was a huge group effort that really benefited from stakeholder engagement as well. I've been Deputy Secretary at Cal EPA for 6+ years, and by some maybe fortuitous or terrible event, in those 6+ years we've seen prolonged drought, the worst fires ever, land subsidence, and all measure of really bad climate activity. And that could seem like something really terrible, but instead it has brought us all together across the agencies and with stakeholders to really accomplish a lot in terms of policy, in terms of action on the ground, in terms of funding with communities. And that's been a really great opportunity, I think, for California, and an opportunity for us to work well outside of our boundaries, not just in the United States, but across the world, on understanding what other people do to combat climate change, and how what we're doing in California can potentially be a model for others. So we have 33 million acres of forest in California, heterogeneous landscapes. You've got northern forests that are enormous and coastally influenced, and you have southern forests that can be scrubbier, chaparral influenced, and pretty dry. So we have a really broad variety of forests in California, which means that there's no one size fits all, there's no one solution or one silver bullet. And so that has been both a challenge and an opportunity to look for ways that we can work on forests with our stakeholders. Generally in the forest space, this probably happens in all states, there has been a lot of disagreement. However, I think because of everything that's been affecting forests with these high severity fires, we've come to several areas of agreement that are really important. So first, we all understand that our forests are burning with greater severity, and that we have a longer fire season because of anthropogenic factors. So because of mismanagement of forests, because of long-term fire exclusion, because of climate change, we're seeing these vast changes within our forests. So we all agree on that. We all agree that bringing fire back into the landscape through prescribed fire is a really important approach. And that's huge, because in civil society in the past, There wasn't a lot of agreement that prescribed fire was an important avenue. So that's really important. We also agree that we shouldn't expect the forests of the future to look like the forests of the past. We've already seen climate change affecting forests in California with species range shifts, moving upslope, losing habitat, oaks creeping into where there used to be conifers. So we're seeing those species range shifts, and we understand that we're not going to get back to what we had as we see these overnight temperatures increase and daytime temperatures increase. And finally, I'm going to repeat what Maida said. We agree that we need to keep forests as forests. So I'm talking about forests from a climate perspective, but we really think of forests as having this multiple benefit to California. So water, air, livelihoods, wonder, the ability to visit all of these wonderful places throughout the country that are forested. Those multiple benefits are critically important for the future of California. These are iconic forests, and without them, we're not California. So we understand that we need to keep forests as forests and work with local and county officials to make sure that development doesn't threaten these forests into the future. So we agree on those issues. Of course, there's a lot of disagreement, particularly around wood products and what you do with harvested products, how intensively you harvest, when you burn. So we do still have some disagreement, and I think that in the forest space, that's gonna be par for the course for a long time. And that's okay. I think we can all continue to learn from one another, and I'm sure we all share those differences across our boundaries. But so we've made a lot of progress in the areas where we have agreement. So as Laurie mentioned, and I already noted, we did produce a forest carbon plan this past May at the same time that the governor put out an executive order establishing a forest management task force. And the plan and the task force actually followed an emergency order from several years ago to address tree mortality in California. We had 129 million dead trees, and there was another count recently that increased that number. So we have a lot of dead and dying trees in California as a result of drought, pests that are naturally occurring but generally have taken over because of drought and climate change. So we have a lot of action out of the governor's office that translates to implementation within our agencies and with the stakeholders. We additionally, since 2014, we have put $379 million of the proceeds from the state's carbon pricing program, or cap and trade, into forest management. So that includes both urban and rural forests. But so it's about $95 million per year, and those are just on state managed forests. And of course, as I mentioned, we have 33 million acres, 19 million of those are federal. So the rest are where we have some influence. Fortunately, we do have some influence on federal management through good neighbor authority agreements, and so we can spend some money on federal lands as well. Interestingly, so that's money since 2014. In this next year alone, we are looking at a minimum of $374 million for 1 year for forests. And that's a result of voter-supported Prop 68 and the cap and trade funds. So we're seeing a quadrupling of investments in the next year. It's a big deal to have that much money. It's also scary because we really have to do something with it. We really have to recognize the heterogeneity of our forests and do regionalized implementation and not just try a piecemeal approach of throwing a bunch of solutions onto the map without thinking about aggregating them for bigger benefit. So we have a huge opportunity in front of us, an administration changeover, all of these other demands in terms of climate change, fires burning. So it feels very big right now that we need to get this right. And as a result, I think that we really need to think about how we work across our jurisdictional boundaries. They're arbitrary when it comes to forests. Yeah. It doesn't matter to the ecosystem. So we need to think across these jurisdictional boundaries to recognize all of the benefits that we can see from investing these funds, these personnel resources, this energy together. So I think there's a couple of areas of agreement where we can look at this unprecedented funding level and make a difference. So first, I think that all of us have to go through the NEPA process. We all have to go through permitting processes, good neighbor authorities. If we can share those and potentially streamline the time or make the time more efficient in getting to those agreements, that would be huge, right? And so that does mean working with the public to make sure that everyone understands what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. And so that brings me to the second opportunity, which is education. I think I'm biased, but California has a really, really challenging separation between urban and rural communities. Urban communities, I think, and I live in an urbanized community in Sacramento, but I sort of hail from a tent and a family that composted for my whole life. So, so despite living in an urbanized community, I understand that when I turn on my tap, I have natural resources to thank, and intact forest to thank. But the average Californian doesn't think about forests unless they're going on vacation and they have to redirect because there's a fire. So that's the only time they really think about them. And most people live on the coast where there are trees and there are fires, as we saw last year, really deadly fires. And sadly, it's those deadly fires that are bringing us to a moment where we're able to bridge that urban-rural divide. But I think we all have that issue. We have highly urbanized areas that don't necessarily understand or value natural resources and all of the both tangible or monetized benefits they bring, and then the intangible existence benefits they bring. So we really need to bring that educational opportunity home and try to get rid of that urban-rural separation. Then the final area where I think we can really collaborate is on experimental treatments. We have our own de facto experimental treatment because we all have different policies. So we've tried all these different policies across our 3 states for many, many decades. We could use those as experimental treatments and say, we've tried this sort of management. What has that produced? How has that helped with fire? How has that helped with climate change? We could also visit one another's experimental forests to take a look at those treatments on the ground. And so I think there's an opportunity here today through the U.S. Climate Alliance, through the Pacific Coast Collaborative, through everything we do out of the summit, to learn from one another and potentially put together more learning labs specifically on forest management. So that instead of trying this as a one-off and really costing a lot of money and a lot of personnel and a lot of time, we can learn from one another and jumpstart right into the next phase of management. So we have a lot of work ahead of us. I'm clearly energetic and enthusiastic about it. We are undergoing an administration changeover in California, and so I hope someone like me or I will be sitting in this chair in the future to keep it going. But I'm looking at Edie, who's smiling, because I expect her to carry the torch if I'm gone. So thank you again so much, and I really look forward to the rest of the dialogue.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I actually love that I've got Oregon on my right, which I grew up in Oregon, spent 18 years growing up in Multnomah County, Portland, and then I'm back home a little bit because right between college before law school, I spent 2 years in San Francisco.
Nice.
So I feel like I'm covering the whole stretch of the West Coast now that I'm in Washington State. So for those who don't know, I'm Commissioner of Public Lands in Washington State, and I'm going to talk just really briefly about the breadth of things that I cover and how it has an unbelievable connection to climate change and then obviously forestry. So as a Commissioner of Public Lands, I manage 2.6 million acres of aquatic land, so your entire coast, your Puget Sound, all your lakes, rivers, and streams. You guys might have heard about the Atlantic salmon last year. I certainly did. That was one of our leases that we had. Managed about 1 million acres of agricultural land, 2 million acres of forest land, and then pretty significant portfolio of commercial industrial land, Safeways, Costco's, Fred Meyer's, Swedish hospitals. I just think second largest land manager in the state of Washington, second only to the federal government, but we have a pretty diverse portfolio of land that we manage. In addition to that, I oversee the Washington State Geology Survey, so we have 5 volcanoes, landslides, tsunamis, earthquakes. We respond, not only do we do the information and data, but also how do we make our communities more resilient to the most significant threats that lie under the earth. In addition to that, I run the largest wildfire fighting team in the state of Washington. And as you all know, when we think about forests right now, we think about wildfires. I will say that I think in Washington State, while we call ourselves the evergreen state, why? Because who couldn't, looking at the beautiful ponderosa pines on the eastern part of our state all the way to the Douglas firs that, blanket everything from the Cascades out to the coast. We have been known for our forest land, but I will tell you that I think the public and the community in Washington State largely takes that forest land for granted. They certainly love, and it's why they move there and stay there, but I think this fire season, when we in Washington State had the worst air quality in the entire world for a significant part of our summer, no thanks to a little bit of Oregon and a lot of Canada and our own problems of our own forest management, it has become a very significant wake-up call for our state. A key part of that is we've had our most significant wildfires with over 1,250 wildfires to date just this year. 40% of those fires were west of the Cascades. So the west part of our state saw fire like it's never seen before, and it's finally really brought to the attention the importance of our forests, obviously, that we take for granted, but also the significant condition that our forests are in. We in Washington State have just completed last year a forest health plan, a 20-year forest health plan for Eastern Washington, because we know more about the forest health crisis in Eastern Washington than we do in the western part, but we are certainly know we have to turn our attention to that. Just in the eastern part of our state alone, we have 2.7 million acres of forests that are dying. About half of that is federal land, the other half is state, tribal, and private land. We last year completed a 20-year forest health plan that has us setting a goal of treating 70,000 acres a year in central and eastern Washington over the next 20 years. It's about 1.25 million acres. It'll cost the state easily over $30+ million a year. We are also working with the federal government on the Good Neighbor Authority to be able to get in and do the kinds of treatments we know that are going to create more resilient forest landscapes. We're doing it at a watershed level, so we've identified the highest priority forests based on the condition of those forests, how bad it is, and then also proximity to population community centers. And then we are leveraging forest health science to be able to really identify what are the treatments, and we're not looking at it based on boundaries. So we're not looking at who owns it, but we're doing it, what is the specific treatment, then we'll look at the ownership and figure out what the tool and approach is to tackle it. We need to now focus on the western part of our state based on the numbers that we saw within our wildfires this year. It is going to be a larger conversation, very different forests, as you all are probably very aware of, but also it's going to be a more challenging conversation because the public really is not as informed about what those forest health issues are and what does that treatment mean. And I think frankly we all are learning it in real time. So a big part of the work that we're going to be doing in addition to forest health is we completed a climate risk assessment on all 6 million acres of land that we manage to identify what are the risks that that landscape is seeing, and then how do we prepare. So obviously everything from, in the forest health crisis, how do we diversify our forests? How do we actually look at it as it's changing, as we're seeing reduced water with 96% of our state in a drought this year. It's a lot of why it's the rainy state is no longer rainy anymore. It's why we are seeing those fires. Part of that climate risk assessment will help us develop the tools and resources we need for managing our own land and making them more resilient. But one of the things we're also going to be tackling is we believe that making our 6 million acres of land may be our responsibility in managing as stewards for the public, because it generates $325 million for our state. That funds 39 counties and our schools. We know that management is important for the long-term health and resiliency economically, socially, environmentally of state, but we also believe we have a bigger job. And the bigger job is, because we are the second largest landowner in Washington State, how do we actually truly set up our communities to be more resilient in the face of climate change, not just the lands we manage. This is going to be a much bigger issue for us to tackle. We are hoping, we worked on the carbon legislation last year that came, it did not pass. We right now are looking at a climate initiative that will go to the voters in November. The whole hope behind our work on both of those was to make sure that it was focusing on making our lands and our waters more resilient to climate change, because as you pointed out, our rural communities are actually been on the front line of climate change for a long, long time. And it impacts every part of their life, not just the environment, but also their economy, but also because those communities are the ones that are going to be feeding a rapidly growing population. They're the ones that are also going to be housing a rapidly growing population as we look at our built environment. Our hope in that conversation is to actually start to elevate and illustrate that one of the biggest threats to the state of Washington isn't just climate change, but it's the population growth and the management of our lands within Washington State. And I don't just mean the Department of Natural Resources lands that we manage, but the larger context. We have 1,500 people moving to Seattle every single week, and we don't in any way have the housing to house them. We also, so we're seeing an unbelievable population growth that is putting ever increasing pressures on our working forests and working farmlands. The reality is, in addition to my role, I also regulate the timber industry. So I not only regulate the warehousers, but also the small forest landowners. About 40% of our state is owned by small forest landowners, and many of them are aging and new generation is coming in with the threat about population growth, and also this context of the health of forests and its actually retention and return on investment. I think our biggest threat is going to be how do we actually ensure that we are protecting our working forest lands and our old growth forests along with our farmlands in the face of climate change and population growth, and how do we, and we see this whole conversation around carbon and carbon markets as an opportunity to finally do a couple of things. One is, how do we start to look at the lands that we manage along with the private forest landowners and grow in more aggregate, larger blocks and chunks of forest, because the more they're together versus a checkerboard approach, the healthier those forests tend to be, the easier it is to manage, the more sustainable the water and the land can be. In addition to that, our hope is also to be able to identify and start identifying some of those fallow lands, because we can buy at the state and plan out 50 to 80 years, because we plan intergenerationally, not just based on tomorrow's return or next year's return, that we may be able to identify fallow lands, lands that were once put in agriculture back 50 years ago, but actually are very well suited for forest land, and we should be looking at buying those and being able to convert those to working forest land as we see that conversion and threat happening. The third is, we're hoping that the initiative or carbon legislation, or hopefully sooner rather than later, because we are looking at California and the opportunities you've created, is an ability to create a tiered funding mechanism, right? A tiered funding mechanism says we know old growth provides huge amount of value for clean air, clean water, and carbon sequestration, which we need. How do we make sure we can fund and support that? Because we don't have that mechanism that exists now. The second is, how do we actually help work with the small forest landowners to give them a value and a reason for holding on to that land as being competitive, maybe not as competitive as subdivisions, but pretty significant competitive, because they do provide that value that will then hopefully prevent the conversion of those working forest lands. And then the last part that we're working on is really the rural economic piece, because we know the biggest threat to working forest lands, and I have to continue to add working farmlands because we see it too, is the loss of that economic stream, the loss of it being economically valuable. And so we're working on both the public side and the private side. We are hoping that we're going to have more mechanisms and tools in place, because while we have a Growth Management Act, it in no way compares to the one the Oregon has. And we don't have the markets that California has created for the value of working forest land and for old growth critical forest habitat. So it's great to be here and be able to be part of this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege here. I think three things that we all heard here was kind of the 3 R's. You all agree on the 3 R's. Reduce forest lost, so maintain forest lands. Restore former forests, bring back forests that were converted to agriculture. And that is, for example, in California, we've converted over 40% of our forests to other uses, and the majority of that from the base is agriculture. And restore higher levels of carbon to our working forest landscape. So in addition to the other points of agreement, you have that. So I want to ask you about a further point of agreement. And that is, in business, we have generally accepted accounting principles. And that's how everybody knows how to do business. They know what something is worth, what to invest. Many people would say that the business of addressing climate change is the biggest single business challenge we have. So I'd like to ask you all about your thoughts on a shared approach, a generally accepted set of accounting principles for carbon in our natural lands. you've identified we share these systems, we know how they respond, we share science. Could we share an accounting system so everybody knew that where we were on Earth reflected what we saw in the atmosphere with natural lands? Maybe Ashley, you could start first.
Sure. So California has a pretty robust monitoring, reporting, and accounting system, a verification system for emissions throughout the state. So when we set up our program, our climate program after AB 32 passed in 2006, we set up this monitoring, reporting, and verification program for emissions within the built environment. And that program was what allowed us to understand where we needed to put climate policies. So once we understood that 40% of our emissions were coming from the automobile sector, we were able to really target policies to that sector, 20% from electricity, so on and so forth. So we're trying to do that right now in the natural environment. So we've got a built environment system, and what we're working on right now is an inventory for natural and working lands. We should have a skeletal framework by the end of this year, and by 2020 we hope to have a great, really tested framework so that we understand interventions on the landscape and how they potentially change that accounting system, that accounting on the ground. So if you're thinking about developing in a particular area, you'll have a better understanding of the carbon loss or the climate benefits of moving in one direction or another. It's a really, really challenging thing to do in natural and working lands, in part because the history of those lands is so variable, and the control that we have over activity on those lands is also quite variable, whether it's at the local level, county, state, federal. We don't really have control over the way those lands change. So at a minimum, we'd like to understand the value of those lands beyond all the multiple benefits we've talked about, and just look specifically at this one value, at the carbon or greenhouse gas value, and see where we get from there. So I think as soon as we can get that done, I think we'd be more than happy to share our accounting principles so that we could all try to use them. It is a Herculean effort. We've hired modelers. We're working with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, USGS, the Nature Conservancy, a number of people to understand this inventory process. It will take peer-reviewed work, a lot of workshops, but we're like I said, partway there. We hope to have something by the end of this year, and then by 2020 we'll be in even better shape. Yeah.
So my answer will be pretty quick and simple. I think we all know that when it comes to climate change, we are very, very far behind, and we have to rapidly make changes as quick as possible. And unfortunately, these things are pretty complicated, especially when we try to bring numbers and accounting to it. I'm a big believer in not reinventing the wheel. In Washington State, we are very, very far behind. I remember 10 years ago being part of an entire investigation to do an accounting as we set goals. And these were not goals that were regulated, they were goals that were sort of idyllic and desired, right? We went through a year's process of developing those. Much of that work has gone to the side and has actually never been put in fruition because there was no regulation or real teeth to it, to those goals. I'm looking to California and the work you've done, because I honestly think my state and most of my community would ideally love to be putting something in place now. I mean, I have timber companies who actually have a pretty diverse portfolio around the world that are leveraging carbon markets, whether it's in California or New Zealand or other places, that would love to be able to utilize them in Washington State even more. And so if we can rapidly move to that once we have sort of that, and we don't even necessarily, because we could do it voluntarily.
Right.
So we look forward to looking at the work you've done and actually leveraging it, so thank you.
Yeah, well, and I should add on there, you can already look at our offset program.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's already places you can get started where people appreciate them in California because they're making money off of it. So definitely follow up with that.
Yeah. And I would say from Oregon's end, ditto on the thank you, Ashley. We are definitely looking forward to what you all are developing and what's being done in other states and countries as well. I think from Oregon's end, we are very closely looking at what's happening in our neighboring states, and we want to make sure that where it makes sense, it's consistent. The thing that I've always encouraged, and again, looking back at the 40 years we have in place of the work we've already done to protect our forests, is that and I think California and Washington share this, is what we don't want to do is stop doing the good stuff while we wait for accounting systems to be put in place. There is a lot we know about what the right things are to do, and that's keeping our forests for us, making sure that we keep them as carbon sinks, making sure that we're sustainably managing and restoring our systems, expanding our biodiversity, that we can be doing now and we have been doing for a long time. Our states, I think, are a leader in that area, so I really look forward to what you all are developing as we continue to do the work that we've all already started on.
Can I just add part of what I'm hoping about this accounting context too is I'm obviously in the political frame, right? I mean, I'm statewide elected that, ran for office in 2016, and I just have to put a mark on that. In 2016, I was the other Hilary on the ballot, at least in Washington State, and there were a number of counties in Washington State that for the first time actually voted for a Republican governor, Republican president since Hoover. Okay, it was a real direct moment in Washington State of recognizing that we have significant number of rural communities. Many of them, and the ones I'm talking about, are on the coast of Washington with some of the most beautiful forest lands that, remember not only the marble murrelet issue that has been front and center for it, but also the spotted owl, right? And a lot of them, sort of a frame has happened in our state, especially in the sort of the coastline of where those beautiful old growth forests are, of the environment versus the economy, something that I know your state and your state are not new to. I see this opportunity of us looking at carbon and looking at carbon funding and looking at the value of forests for a much larger suite of things than just the built environment as a way of actually finally recognizing the context of what these communities have given up, but also the opportunities they provide to us and us valuing it more than just showing up and enjoying it and walking through it.
I think the point you're making is extremely well taken. California has put hundreds of millions of dollars into what are rural jobs, restoring those forests to health, and also cost sharing with landowners through buying things like conservation easements where the public cost of that land is borne by the public. So both carbon markets and these direct state investments have the opportunity for a multi-billion-dollar economy.
I want to just throw a couple numbers so that you have them in your head about this. I think, Laurie, that's a really important point. There have been studies done, both in Washington and Oregon. The restoration economy, for every $1 million that we invest, so we invest $100 million biennium or so in restoration work on forest lands, estuaries, agricultural lands, and others. Every $1 million is 15 to 24 local jobs that are created. 90 cents of every dollar is staying inside the state. And so for us, that is a big conversation. Now, when I look at those communities and have met with a lot of the local contractors, we've got third and fourth generation folks who at some point in time were building logging roads and harvesting timber, who are now helping us manage those logging roads to reduce sediment and restoring those systems. It is something that it's not just words that we want strong local economies. This type of work and the work of the carbon investments that are going on in California that we hope to be doing in the future really does create and sustain local jobs. It helps us keep our agriculture industry strong and prosperous when we're managing those lands for sustainability. They can be managing them for the next few generations. So for us, it really is not just words on paper, but it is a strong economic issue.
It's a huge one. I'm going to take the opportunity to open up for questions more broadly here with that. Harry, I see you're ready to go. So he hit the button for anybody else, but I hope you all will engage.
I heard Laurie ask you a question about the desirability of a forestry equivalent of in the business world generally accepted accounting principles. And I thought I heard your responses to these that I could summarize as that it's a work in progress in each of your 3 states. If I heard that accurately, then I would offer up to you, what about you 3 states creating a tri-state task force to get a uniform and comparable set of principles that would make it possible for you to talk to one another?
So we all are part actually of the Pacific Coast Collaborative, also with British Columbia, and that does give us an opportunity to have some of these conversations. Largely through the Pacific Coast Collaborative, they've been focused on the built environment, vehicles, and things like that, so it would be important to bring this conversation to that dialogue. Additionally, we're part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, and that's 16 states and Puerto Rico, where we actually already had one learning lab on natural and working lands, supported by Doris Duke Foundation. And so there would be an opportunity to also do another one specifically on forests and accounting. So there are definitely opportunities to have that sort of dialogue, and I think it's more that we need to say, this is something that we need to do immediately. Let's not waste money and time each funding our own process, but let's coordinate and make sure we just use one.
I mean, I'll follow up on yours. I think I started by saying that I think in Washington our forests have been largely taken for granted, and that my hoping this last year, my hope is that that no longer is the case, whether it's the conversion or whether it's the forest health crisis, right? Just largely because the entire state has had wildfires in every corner, and it has been completely covered in smoke, which is unusual for us. And we spend most of our year already gray and dark, and our summers are really valuable to us. And we didn't get one. I mean, it was still dark and gray. But that being said, I think part of what I think we should do, and I think we should take you up on your offer. I think there's been some conversations that have been happening, partly because a lot of the focus at the government level, to your point, is around the built environment and energy efficiency. And I'll just say, and I saw it in my own state when carbon legislation was being moved, that it continues to be transportation and energy, both being really important. You know, transportation is our biggest greenhouse gas emissions in Washington State. We obviously need to get a hold of it, but it's directly related to the conversion of forests, right? And we really need to make forest and that land, sort of the working forest and our natural areas, have a much higher profile and a value, not only in the context of the political dialogue, but in the accounting systems. And so I'm all for it. And look, you know, I think we've been having some conversations actually with BC. We've been talking about an MOU actually. Hopefully, we were hoping to get it locked in for this summit. We are down to some final language that would actually look at carbon storage and would agree for California, Washington, and BC to agree on looking at and focusing on forest and carbon storage as an opportunity.
We have until the end of the week.
I am not giving up. I called BC yesterday, so if they are listening right now, please work toward
I want to note that the only reason she didn't say Oregon is because Oregon has climate legislation which is being developed right now, and they have a couple of task force that are working on that. We're pleased to be part of both of them. But
not excluding you in any way.
Not feeling excluded.
And that so when Oregon was looking at its climate legislation, actually the reason they hit the pause button was the importance of including forests and other land in the discussion directly, not as a regulated capped sector, but from this point of view of opportunity, whether it was for offsets or whether it's for state investments. So we would absolutely want Oregon to be on that MOU too as soon as they can, but I think that's going to have to wait till after November.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges that we look at, and I appreciate you raising that as we dig into this, is we have, all of us in our states, constantly in our ear when we think about these sectors where the livelihood is on the land, right? That the buttons that you turn, you have to be really careful about the intended and unintended consequences of those buttons. So that's where, you know, we've got folks bending our ears. They watch California. It's great for us. We can peek over the proverbial fence and see what's going on. But I think there's a lot to learn as we enter into this about that combination of sustainable communities, right? And there are a lot of communities who don't want their sustainability to just be a carbon market.
Right.
And so I think it's that balance of how do we actually keep sustainable industries in those communities, and it's tough.
Yeah.
One of the examples that an agriculture person gave me once is, I'm going to jump for a second here, but McDonald's had a metric that was how quick you could get people through the line in the drive-thru, right? And they had somebody who was a poor performer, and they called him out on it, and within the next 3 weeks, their numbers just went through the roof. They were performing top in the country because they were sending their employees through the drive-through line so that they could get quick counts of people going through. And I say that a little facetiously, but it's the thing that keeps ringing in my head as we think about how we approach these things where people's livelihoods are wholly dependent. How do we make sure that we're really moving in a direction that benefits both those communities and the climate that we want to benefit?
Yeah, that's a cautionary tale, I think, and important because we don't want to commoditize natural and working lands in a way that we don't actually get that intrinsic value from them. And it's a really challenging thing to keep track of, right? That I think we haven't moved into this space a lot because it's dangerous to try to value every acre for its carbon value or for its ag value or for its recreational value. So you really have to be careful with just commoditizing everything from a climate perspective and maintaining that multiple benefit. And that's, I think, why it's hard to talk about it in a legislative session, or it's hard to talk about it in, in one boardroom. It's so much bigger than a bill, and that's been challenging.
Well, I think this is another point of agreement, is that when we're talking about forests, we're talking about climate. We're not talking solely about carbon. Carbon is simply a facet.
Right.
You can commoditize carbon, we have,
Right.
but you can't commoditize climate, which is a process and people are part of that process. Nick, I think you were going to ask a question. Is that fair?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love the conversation. Nick Wilbrook from Food Forest Conservation. We're developing a forest resilience fund, trying to help bring more resources to the things you're all talking about. And was really curious from each of the states, hearing about the massive influx of additional money in California and some of the challenges with that, and with the other states with the interest in forests. What do you see as your biggest challenges to increasing the pace and scale of restoration, or whatever the state's goals are on the ground? Is there a backlog of ready projects or other areas where you guys are spending your resources in?
So, I'll jump into that one because this is something, so again, our agency is somewhat unique in that we work on behalf of a lot of natural resource issues. Dick Peterson is here in the room, used to be the director of DEQ. We would do water quality investments, voluntary investments with him, forest investments, agriculture investments. And so Oregon is, population-wise, the smallest of the 3 states. What we are finding is that we have incredible projects. We have absolutely been increasing the pace and scale. We are doing, for example, in Ashland, a multi-million-dollar, multi-year investment to protect the source water for Ashland, to reduce the threat of wildfires, to make that forest land system more biodiverse and healthier. Contracting, using some amazing tribal companies to do the contracting locally. It has been a phenomenal example. Those examples don't exist everywhere, and so I think, Nick, your question is really key, that when we look at the level of investment that we think about with a Cap and Invest program, not all of our communities have the local capacity to be able to implement. Not all of them have a Pacific Forest Trust or a Nature Conservancy. And so as one of the places where we're lucky as an agency, we are permanently funded, which is really cool. I highly recommend it to any other state. We get 7.5% of the state's lottery revenues permanently dedicated. Because of that, we are, and our board has made a shift. We are really focused on local community capacity. That started with heavy investments in what we call watershed councils in Oregon, soil and water conservation districts. But now we're looking more at a web base. So what does a community need to be resilient and successful? And we face an issue, I'm guessing the other states do as well, not just population growth, but population dynamic. So some of the places that are in most need of this work are losing population, are losing the local folks who are doing that work on the ground. And so we're really struggling. Our board has taken an intentional effort to figure out what that web looks like and how we make sure it's not just because a community has the capacity, like a place like Bend in Oregon, to do the work, but how do we make sure that same work is going on in Burns and on the Malheur forest, just like it is in Western Oregon. So, huge challenge.
Maybe we could collaborate on creating the Conservation Corps here for the restoration, the Climate Restoration Corps, because all 3 states are lacking people to do the work that's needed to be done in forests and restoration. But as the kind of investment that could launch that and bring that economic robustness back into our rural communities, something that we could, an idea.
The WPA for the forest.
Yeah, the climate PA.
Yeah.
So I'll add just a little perspective, because when I came into office in early 2017, forest health was front and center, one of my priorities, creating more resilient forests. And I had 2 people that did that in an agency of over 1,500 people, okay? So we are rapidly building an entire program, right? I mean, it is like sort of like going from, okay, 20-year plan, 70,000 acres a year. We can't do it immediately if we don't have people. So this, we're doing a couple things. So first, this coming budget season, I will be making a request for over $30 million just to build a wildfire forest health program that actually sets Washington State up for success. And let me explain just a little bit. I'm calling it the Forest Health Wildfire New Deal. History did teach me something. And the way that we're looking at, the reason why we're the largest wildfire fighting team in the state is because half of my 1,500 plus employees go out and fight fires during the season, which takes them away from all their other responsibilities. They may have been doing the one who's doing the silviculture program. They may have been the one that was helping set up that restoration work in our forest. If all of a sudden we've been fighting fires full 100% from April still to today, it means they're pulled off from their day jobs, and we're basically just not able to do any of what we're supposed to be doing. So my goal will be that we will secure 30 new firefighters, and when they're not fighting fires, they will be focused fully on forest health treatments. That gives us, a lot of times when we hire our seasonal firefighters, they're seasonal, we can't be able to pay them full time, and they've got to go on to raise families and other responsibilities. So that's the key. We are also looking to expand our camps program. We have a pretty significant camps program that works to fight fires, so everything from, our correction system, right? I know it's gotten some negative publicity recently, but in our state, we are really increasing the funding and support for them. It gives them an opportunity to train, and we actually have a rehire program where we will hire them afterwards or help them secure jobs. We also have the same, we're doing forest health with our nacelle boys camp as well. For us, we see this an opportunity. Oftentimes we all know the value of our forest for actually our emotional, physical, and mental well-being. For us, we believe that we can actually connect that context of forest health and creating more resilient forest directly with actually ensuring we have a more resilient, healthy population of people. So we're going to be rolling out some significant new programs there to be able to actually expand the people we have to do that work.
And I'd say from California, it's really a scale issue. We have money, we don't have enough personnel, but we do have money, which can bring personnel to the table. But it's a scale issue. I mean, right now, it's sort of like popcorn, where all of the projects are going around the state, and they need to be aggregated, they need to be put all in one place for a while, just to see what benefit we get from that. So it's almost like we need to preferentially invest in one particular area before we start moving to other areas, and that politically is not acceptable. So the right path isn't necessarily politically acceptable, it's not necessarily acceptable from, NIMBYism, things like that, and it's not necessarily feasible from a permitting perspective. So I would say that getting to scale in a single location is something that we'd really like to try to do, and that might be building out one entire regional framework in the next couple of years, but we need to bring everyone into the tent to do that.
I just want to add one more thing. Last year, when I took this role, I really learned quickly, how we have not actually invested in the next natural resource specialist, right? So we have a whole generation, right, as I look at it, they're aging, and I can't get foresters. Weyerhaeuser can't even hire foresters, and they pay really well, right? So we have a really significant gap in the people that we need who are going to be managing these forests, not only now but in the future. And frankly, we're going to need them even more given climate change. So last year, one of the projects we launched was a Rural Communities Partnership Initiative, which is a bigger story that I can tell later. But one of the projects that came forward was a project at the Klamath School District. If people don't know Klamath, think about the coal export facility that was denied and turned down in Washington State. That's a community. That community has lost logging jobs. They have lost huge amount of and have a significant economic challenge. The school district has 36 acres of forest that belongs to the school that hasn't been managed. I don't know how long ago, and it's a mess. So we partnered with the school district to now teach 25 kids a year in forestry management, where they're doing active learning on the ground. And when I met with those kids, I said, why'd you sign up for this class? By the way, if you're a woman or a young woman, there was only one woman there. We need more of you in this field. But I said, why? And they said, it is so great to be learning outside of the classroom. So we're looking at investing, since we fund the buildings that house our kids, we want us to build a program that's about, we also fund the lands that teach our kids. And we're now getting other school districts, whether they're agriculture is a focus or forestry is a focus or aquatics, to now build more of those programs in partnership with them. So on-hands learning, really cool.
And besides, it's really fun to run a chainsaw. Girls like it, boys like it.
I couldn't believe how much they were smiling. They had just cleared blackberries for the last week, and they were like, "It's so great!" And I was like, "Okay." I love that energy and excitement.
We can do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Other questions here?
Yeah.
Lady.
Hi, Annie. That actually kind of segues perfectly into my question. All three of you kind of talked about education and how that's a big barrier for the general public. I'd love to hear from each state, like, what do you feel is your biggest message you'd like to get across, and how do you plan to do that?
Well, I don't want to jump ahead of potential announcements with the summit, so I won't. But I'll just foreshadow that for you in terms of education. But I would say, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I think the rural-urban divide is one that we need to focus on for an educational pathway, and that's really helping in California. All Californians understanding the value of these communities, whether they're really tiny rural communities or really large urban communities. There's no answer to what California will look like, no perfect answer. And so I think the educational pathway has to include an understanding of the importance of these communities and the importance of how climate change is threatening those communities from a resilience perspective, from a people perspective, from a health perspective, and from a natural resource perspective. But again, stay tuned for more summit announcements on climate change education.
So from my end, it's a great question. I think this is a challenge we in the natural resources world have had forever, right? From one end, we want everybody to know everything about everything that we know, and it's not going to happen, right? So what we're trying to do, and this isn't just on the climate front, we're working on some really large water infrastructure initiatives in the state right now to try to figure out how we treat our water infrastructure like we treat transportation, and that includes healthy forests. That includes healthy estuaries and riparian areas as much as it includes lead in pipe in schools. And I think what we found is you have to hit the places that matter to people and not scare them. And I think sometimes in the natural resources world we haven't done that well enough to really connect to the places and the things that matter to people and connect in a way where they feel like they can make a positive impact. And we have to be really careful about thinking through who it is that matters that we reach out to. Nike does not do its campaigns for everybody. They do them for the people who buy the shoes and the clothes. And I think that's another thing we haven't done well in the natural resources, climate, water world, is really thinking about how do we get to those folks who matter the most in the conversation so we can move this forward. We have not solved it, but I think one of the things that we've learned both in agriculture and forestry is, for example, you don't have a conversation with a farmer about their impacts to climate change. You have a conversation with a farmer about how you reduce their energy use so that you reduce the bottom line monthly payments that they're making on their energy bills. You reduce their water use so that they don't have to manage their water as much. And again, I think that's a place we can all be working really closely together, is to figure out the messages that resonate the most with the people who matter the most in these conversations. And if you can solve that for us, great.
So this topic is actually a really great conversation piece. Largely I'm a political person, right? So, when I came into office, there were people who were very, very afraid of me. They thought I had two heads and breathed fire. And then there was a whole other side that was super, super excited about me. I mean, obviously 25 years working in environmental protection and land use. You can imagine I made a lot of people really happy and frightened a lot of people. I think that what has been the most surprise, and not necessarily to myself, but to a lot of people in our state, is that Eastern Washington, Central Washington, rural Washington very, very much has a very close relationship with me. And I park that back to my family, where my grandfather is a Republican conservative rancher who's like, don't tax me, government, don't tell me what to do. I know how to manage my land. I've been managing it for years. to my father, who went to Reed College and pretty much was a socialist, not necessarily even a liberal progressive Democrat. You know that from Reed College.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so I sat and spent most of my childhood growing up with both of them fighting voraciously and saying, you guys are not that far apart. You're just not listening to each other, right? I spend an enormous amount of my time first in those communities because showing up is number one. If you in any way believe that you can help change the future trajectory on for climate and natural resource management, protection, and survival without showing up in a community where natural resources is what they do, eat, breathe, and sleep every day of their life, and not only theirs, their parents and their children's, you are missing the boat completely. One, you have to show up, and when you show up, you have to not believe you have all the answers and all the solutions, but instead believe simply, I care, I want to be here, I want to understand how I can help you, how I can help your farm survive, your forest survive, how I can help your community not only survive but thrive. Let's have a conversation. And in that, take in more than you give out. And I will say, what amazes me is that every single day, these communities and these people in our rural communities and our natural resources are on the front line of climate change, and they know it. Not a day goes by that they don't get up and go, something's different, and I'm scared about the future. And our biggest challenge is, I'd say, just in the whole national as well as statewide dialogue, is that we're not speaking the same language, and we're not listening, but frankly, we have largely all the same values.
One of the interesting terms that all three of you have used is this concept of frontline communities and who's being affected by climate change. And I think in the typical urban and media world, people think of inner cities, they think of coastlines, they don't think of our vast rural spaces, where these communities are seeing their climate changing all the time, and they're very much affected by it. And I think that's something that within that national dialogue, these three states actually can contribute in a significant way. That rural communities are frontline communities for climate change, and that's where a lot of the answers to bringing the country together, frankly, are. Because like your father and grandfather, we're not that far apart, even if we're yelling a lot of the time. We have time for two more questions. Ed, I knew you had your hand up.
I know how when I watch television or radio, they report a fire and they report $7 billion worth of buildings destroyed. Then they say 130,000 acres, but they never say what the acres were worth. And I'm wondering why, as in forest and conservation, we're not saying we lost 12,000 deer, $8 million worth of sack timber or things. When our agencies are making the report themselves on the news, why are we writing off the forest as just acreage and not as a valuable commodity?
Thank you for saying that.
Yes, exactly.
I know.
Okay,
tried,
one at a time.
No. I tried to get those in all of the reports last year and this year, and I failed through getting things through our comms shop. So thank you for saying that. And I partially think we need the public who consumes news to demand that information, because I was one person inside of an agency trying to get those talking points out through our press releases, and I was unsuccessful. So I think the more you can demand that information, call your agencies, call your elected officials and say, so what about all these other resources? Then we'll get the questions and we'll have to answer them. But so I think we need demand for that.
As somebody who runs a significant agency that fights fires and also faces significant challenges and damage to, last year over 400,000 acres of our land that we manage and oversee, not per se our own, but our small forests and large timber companies as well as our federal lands burned. I get in front of a lot of elected officials and I sort of have key bullet points that I say all the time. One, here's how much your fires cost you, and over the last 5 years alone, Washington State, less than California, I'm sorry, but has spent $1 billion just fighting fires. That's it, right? We have harm, we tell specifically how much acres burned, what type of acreage that was. For us, it's largely forest and ag. Fortunately, many of our communities have been quite protected. And then we talk about what the impact was to the economy, like what was that resource would have contributed to the economy, and also then which communities were largely impacted. And then I pivot and say, by the way, if you fund upfront forest health and more resource wildfire suppression, I can keep all of those costs down. So, and I'll tell you how specifically we done it. 2015, 1,400 fires on the landscape in Washington State. 2015, largest fire season we've ever had. We burned 1 million acres. Forest and ag, largely forest, and I'm sorry, I don't have the top of my head, it's in my notes behind me, the specific dollar cost that was. This year, we've burned already 1,250, probably when I go back and look at the news for today, it'll be about 1,300 acres in Washington State, and our fires we've kept to 300,000 acres burned. All right, that's a massive difference. Higher number obviously in fires, but the amount burned, and it's because of the tactics we're using of pre-positioning our fire equipment in those areas we know based on forest health condition it's going to be bad, and based on our meteorology reports, and making sure we're leveraging every air asset we have. But my budget for the last 10 years on fire has only increased $2.5 million over 10 years, while my fires have more than doubled. So this legislature is definitely going to be waking up to the needs I have, because we will keep those costs down, we'll keep the damage to the communities, the economies, and the landscapes down with those resources up front on forest health and wildfire suppression.
They covered it.
Okay. Well, I think also Ed's point was, what about talking about the damage to the watershed,
Right.
the cost
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
water
Yeah.
function,
Exactly.
the loss of biodiversity. But I think your point is one that everybody in this room could really help with our legislators, which is $1 spent today saves $100,000 to $100,000 next year.
Right.
So investing now in that $1 million that leads to
An ounce of
24.
prevention is worth
You
a
got
pound
it.
of care.
That's right. We're with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had a question?
Yeah, thank you. Dick Peterson, I'm with Center for Climate Strategies, former director of Oregon DEQ. First of all, I want to thank these great public service servants for doing your job. It's not an easy job, and just hearing you is just great. I really like that. I want to, maybe I'll formulate a question, but I want to agree with this gentleman here. We talk about resilient forests, sustainable forests, money well spent, you know, projects we can grow, or whatever the case is. I am a firm believer that we have to have goals with metrics behind it. We can talk to the local farmers or to the foresters and make it all sound good, but unless there's a specific objective that we're trying to achieve that's goal driven, that we measure and we know we're doing right, and we're investing money in a proper way to achieve, whether it's carbon reduction or resilient forests, we're not going to be able to sustain. But if we have those goals and we're driving towards those, and we're not reacting to an emergency situation, but we continue with that, we can make a lot of progress, and you know, make sure that people in this great area we live in really appreciate what we have and know that they're contributing. So I guess my question, more than anything, is just, is that goal setting and matrix driven solutions in the forefront of your thinking in terms of how to deliver your programs?
So I might start.
And you might wrap in the 30 by 2030 as well.
So from our end, I'm going to speak a little bit more broadly, and I did not plant Dick, but I'm really glad that he asked that question, because this is the piece I said earlier. I have another thing, but I'll wait.
Okay.
So one of the things that we find, so again, we're a unique agency in that we are a public funder. So I look at us as being a foundation, again, with permanent funding. We find consistently when we work with other private foundations, when we work with federal funders, when we work with others, they want to invest in the projects on the ground. People love to see whether it's trees being cut, whether, you know, regardless of what it is, animals being saved, they want to see that. There is a lot of reticence to invest in the planning, in the goal and objective development, and the post-monitoring that comes along with that, and the adaptive management and learning. So you probably all know the planning curve, right? You've got to start with a plan, you've got to set your objectives, You've got to develop long-term strategies, you've got to implement, monitor, adaptively manage, and then rinse, repeat. We have a real challenge, I think, across this country in getting people to invest in the planning, in the objective development, and the monitoring, and the adaptive learning. It's something that our board is really leaning into, because we find, and we've been doing this for about the last 3 years now, investing in local communities to develop long-term, up to 50-year plans for whatever natural resources use they want to focus on in their community. Within that, we ask them very specifically, tell us what it is you're trying to achieve. If I'm an investor, just like any other investor, what is it that I'm investing in? What's going to be different down the road? And how do we develop the proxies to understand, you know, if we've got a 50-year goal, what are the proxies along the way? Is it macroinvertebrates? Is it a reduction in them for unhealthy forests? Is it an increase in the healthy insects that we want to see? What are the things that are the indicators? How many acres of this do we need to do? Is it all of it? Is it 25%? Is it 50%? What are the key areas? And what we're finding when we're doing that with our communities, investing in them, giving them the GIS resources, giving them the travel resources, giving them the science that they need, communities get really excited. And I can turn around to funders and say, here's a program, invest in this. But if I'm the only agency that's out there doing that, we're going to have a few of those in one state. And so I would encourage all of you who connect up with folks to really take home that message, that if we are not doing this strategically, we got a bunch of stuff we're throwing at the wall and we're hoping that something hits. I think the technology has caught up with our ability to plan, and we really need to invest in that.
I'm going to have 2 last words, and then we're going to welcome everybody into a reception.
So I'll go global here. I mean, I think that we all have a lot to learn from our global partners on forestry. There are global partners, especially in tropical forests, who are actually using these remote sensing technologies and using lasers to figure out exactly where they need to be focusing their efforts and their dollars. So metrics do guide us. You know, we have an executive order that says get to 500,000 acres treated annually within 5 years. Get to 35,000 acres of prescribed burn. Spend this much money. Put this much, effort on the ground. Absolutely, we are driven by metrics. I can hand you 4 pages of metrics from the forest carbon plan after this if you would like them. But how to focus those and make sure that we're actually putting the acres in the right place, that's where we need more remote sensing, better data, better technology to actually make sure that we're maximizing those investments on the ground and putting them in the right place. So we do have a lot to learn. We need, better imagery, better satellite data, all of that to really focus it. So metrics drive us. I don't think that they're necessarily the answer. Fortunately, we actually spend a lot on planning. We actually funded $20 million to implement a regional strategy for the forest carbon plan. We put $150 million into funding the forest carbon plan. We're funding everything. The monitoring piece is the one that we have not funded well, and the one that we haven't built out enough to say what's working and what's not working. But I think we've got 2 of the 3 necessary parts done. But yeah, use this opportunity at the Global Summit to also hear, especially from our partners in Acre, Brazil, they're doing so much more than we are on real-time forest management and real-time forest monitoring.
So I'll say on forest health, sort of a metric and accountability, I think we're going to be farther along. We largely set up a plan. We got built commitment of the legislature to that plan, so we're building the resources to do and have clear goals and metrics and have forest health science behind it, right? A bigger challenge that we have is the 2 million acres of forest that we manage just as an agency. We get only 25% of the revenue from those timber sales to manage our forests, all right? And I'm going to tell you, a lot of our land has actually just been set aside largely because of Habitat Conservation's Endangered Species Act, right? So we are trying to operate in the 21st century and managing a significant portfolio of, and not just my working forest land, I didn't even tell you about all my other lands that I manage, with only 25% of the revenue from that to go. And so we are challenged in a number of factors. One, we have more engaged communities because more and more of our communities are living around our forests, right? Which means then, and engagement is a great thing, but it also means time and energy and cost, right? And there's no dollar that comes to do that work. We just have have to figure it out. In addition to that, we then don't also have the ability to know how well we're performing in the management. We've underfunded our silviculture program for years, and we're continuing to do that because during the recession, things got worse. We are starting to, this year, our goal was last year, recognizing sort of the hole we've dug for ourselves and now how we have to get out of it, but with limited resources. We are starting what's an asset management analysis for our 5.6 million acres of land. It's the first time it's been done in 20 years. And the goal of that is to be identifying how our lands, what do we actually have? What's their best, highest function and value? How has the world around it changed in 20 years? And let me tell you, it's changed a lot. How do we actually look outward to lands that we should actually be going out because we can acquire lands and sell the lands that aren't high-performing forest land? Frankly, it's a checkerboard. That's how we got our lands. And some of them are landlocked, so we can only have one tenant anyways to lease that land. My goal is to help remove those from our portfolio because they're no value really to our fiduciary responsibility as well as our environmental responsibility. And then identify higher value working forest land and agricultural lands that we can then bring into the portfolio and actually do it in a way that aggregates so it can create larger blocks and buffers from development. We're and I'll just biggest concern, I mean, a lot of our investors in working forest land in the big sectors are the Hancocks and others that have become really moved to rather than a family working forest model, they're a diverse portfolio. So we're seeing huge blocks selling, but we are not in a position to buy them, though those would be some of the best assets we could bring into our portfolio, not only economically, but environmentally. And my hope is through partnering with the legislature to get the funding for this asset management analyst, I'm bringing them in to be a partner with us in the management, not only for the present, but the long term. Much to say about that.
Well, that was a great point to end on because I would offer us a goal. We know that physically, within the next 100 years, we could manage this landscape to reabsorb all the tons that were released in the last 100 years. Still keeping lands in production, still keeping timber flows, restoring these landscapes. What about a century climate challenge? So that within 100 years, we have reabsorbed all of the CO2 emissions that have come from our management of forests today, inclusive of fire being back on the landscape, because fire is going to be on the landscape.
Yeah.
It's totally possible from a management perspective. Anybody want the numbers? Let's talk out of the reception. But let's take a moment. I really want to thank the three of you. I hate to say with three dynamic leaders like this, not to mention three dynamic female leaders like this, our future is pretty darn good. So thank you all very much for being here.